part of thinking about as an entrepreneur, how do I build a successful business is thinking about like, what do my customers want? What do I need to be able to satisfy this demand? And what is going to ultimately make my company successful? And I think that that's true in other fields as well. What is going to make this successful, this project that I want to work on? If you're in science, you need to be able to prove to other people that this theory is correct, or you need to provide some evidence on some existing debate and be able to convince the other people in your field, like this evidence tells us something about, the world that we live in. Whereas if you're in art, you may be wanting to follow on things that other people are doing, do something totally different. And what is your goal in doing that? Is your goal to change the field of art? Is it to influence the way that people are thinking about painting or film or whatever topic? Or is it something that's just personal to you that's about self-expression? Those are very different goals. And so thinking about the question of like, what do I want with this project? What is going to make this successful to me? And that's what you're then going to try to accomplish to make it a successful project. And so thinking about what is my goal and how do I get there? It's the same kind of thought process for a business that it is for any individual project. How can we, as a community, as a country, create institutions and societies and cultures that are going to foster the development of ideas and innovation?
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Thomas Hogan. Thomas is a professor of economics at the University of Austin, America's newest university, where he's making a return to academia after spending years working in the business world. Thomas has a varied career. He has worked in finance, he's worked in business, he's served as the chief economist for a U.S. Senate committee. And in his work at University of Austin, he is both helping build the culture of a new university as one of the founding members of University of Austin's faculty, but he's also helping develop the economics curriculum that students are going to be going through. In today's episode, Thomas and I talk about what the culture of University of Austin is like and what the first term has been like now that it has concluded. We talk about the approach that he's taking in the classroom, applying a very Socratic discussion-based format for his seminars and employing the Chatham House Rule to help make students feel as comfortable as possible, sharing controversial ideas and debating amongst each other. We talk about the development of University of Austin's economics curriculum and why economics is so important for people to understand, even if they're going into wildly different fields from the economics world. And we talk about some of the books in economics that have been most influential to his way of thinking and some of the books that he would most recommend for people who want to develop a sense of how economics works and how it affects the world around us. This interview was a delight, and I hope you enjoy listening. Thomas Hogan, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, glad to be on.
I'm so excited to get to pick your brain. I have so many questions that I want to ask you. So you are part of the founding faculty at University of Austin, which is the newest university in the country. People aren't really in the business of making new universities these days, so it's a very interesting and unusual thing to get to be a part of.
Right.
And you
Sure.
just finished the very first term of having students in the classroom. How did the first term go? What was it like?
Yeah, it was great. It was very busy. We had, being the first term, there was a lot of stuff going on that we are having to sort of plan on and make up as we go. And part of that is for the coming semesters, planning all the classes that we've never taught before, making sure all the students are engaged, which really wasn't a problem. But also we have a lot of speakers and other events, things for the students to do. And our classes are pretty intense for college freshmen. And so the combination of all those things just made it a busy, but really exciting and fun semester, great, excitement from the students in the classroom, great speakers and interesting events that our students were doing, and then thinking about the future and how we're going to make this successful, busy but really fun and great term.
I was looking at the reading list for the freshman year, and I want to say it's 50 plus books. It's so many texts that the students are reading. It seems like it's a really intensive freshman workload.
Yeah, it certainly is, and a lot of the readings that they have to do are pretty deep readings. When they're gonna do something about Aristotle or some ancient work of literature, that's not something you could just skim over, right? That takes a lot of intense study so that you can, first of all, understand what's being said in a lot of the ancient texts, but then also think about all the very deep, interesting ideas, and then to go in and be able to discuss them in the classroom. That's not just something that you can just do the cliff notes. You have to do a very deep, careful read. And so I'm amazed that our students have been able to pull that off. It was a difficult semester and pretty intense for them, but I think they did a great job, and I know they really enjoyed a lot of it. So it was good.
I imagine it's intense for the faculty too. Like, I've had the pleasure of getting to be on campus some during this first semester and see a bit firsthand of what's happening, but and you can feel the electricity in the air when you walk in. There's just so much energy. People are so fired up about what they're doing. But I would imagine as the faculty who are spinning this experience for the students in real time, I would imagine it's exhausting for you too. You're teaching classes that you haven't taught before. You're probably correcting in real time hypotheses around how the class is supposed to go, but how students are responding to it, what they're able to handle, designing the next term, I would imagine, based on how this term went. But also, like, you're creating a culture and you're doing that in real time. This sounds harder than a normal university position.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder in a couple of ways. Like, one is that at a lot of the schools, they've been around forever, and they have a very standard syllabus and set of teachings and things that are expected. And for us, it's all new, and so we have a lot of things that have never been sort of put together in this way before, and so we have to be ready for that, and the professors have to be really prepared. But like you said, we're also sort of evaluating all of it as it goes along and thinking about how things are working and if things need to be improved. But anytime, if you're at a university, if you're a professor, you typically have a small set of courses that you teach, and you teach them over and over. And so you're pretty familiar with all the topics. And whenever you introduce a new course, you take a lot of time to prepare for that, and then you only do like one new course at a time. But in this term, every course is new. None of these courses have ever been taught before. I will end up teaching like macroeconomics is one of the courses that I've taught a lot of times, and I have a pretty good idea about how that's going to go. But for a lot of the classes that we were doing in the first term, it was all new for the students and for the professors, and so it was, uh, interesting for us reading through all the readings, planning all the discussions and making sure that we knew all the things that we wanted to talk about. Partly because the students are so inquisitive and interested that we had to be extra prepared for anything that might come up that wasn't things that we would normally teach about. And so it was a pretty serious core. Yeah, pretty serious courses, but also, outside of the classroom, guest speakers and events and a lot of other things going on as well. So it's been a lot of fun.
Well, part of the culture of University of Austin is that it's a small school and it's very tightly knit, and the faculty and the students are very interwoven inside of the space. Like, the students have a lot of access to you. So I would imagine beyond just being in the classroom, you're probably getting a lot of questions and discussion from students beyond just your time in seminar.
Yeah, that's true. So I mean, that's true in a couple of ways. So one is that the students are all doing things like forming their own student groups, and so they've already formed an economics club. And so for an economics professor, they asked me if I would be involved with that. And they've got a couple other topics that they're interested in. They also are interested already. Some of them are thinking about jobs and careers. And for me personally, like before I got into academia, I worked in business and finance, and I've taught economics and finance, so I'm familiar with a lot of that students have questions about. Um, and so yeah, it's things that they're working on in the classroom. It's activities that they have. It's thinking about the future. And then my class in particular was called Polaris Ideas, and so it was related to this project that the students are going to have to work on. At the University of Austin, we have this project that's called Polaris that is basically a 4-year project that the students do. So instead of doing just a sort of senior thesis or a 1 term or 1 semester project at the end of their undergraduate years, they have a project that they work on throughout the whole 4 years. And it doesn't have to be, it's not like they have to come in day one and start this new project. Some of them do. Some of them want to start a business or have an idea already about what they're working on. But other students are just going to sort of think about it for the first year or two before they really get into it and hopefully try a couple of different ideas and see what's going to be best for them. And so, because I'm teaching a course that is related to this project, students also want to come in and talk to me about what they should be doing for their project and how they're going to spend the next 4 years building something that might be a business or it might be something related to art or science. And so they, want to come in and talk about it. So I think that's great.
What does this introductory term look like from the perspective of helping students set up their projects? They're working on something for the course of 4 years, but they don't have to have an idea coming in. Part of the beginning of their academic career is figuring out their project, and some students come in and have things already working on, but some students have no idea what they want to do. So my understanding is that the very first courses are designed to help students ideate and kind of build a foundation of how to think about coming up
Right.
with ideas or testing their ideas. What did that look like in the first
Yeah, yeah.
term?
Right. So that's right. So in the first year, the students are taking a combination of things. One, we're trying to give them a sort of broad base of different types of courses. So part of our education is that they do classical readings in philosophy and literature and do sort of deep readings and discussions on those topics. Another part of it is learning quantitative skills. So they're all taking mathematics and statistics, and they're going to have to learn Python programming for even the students that just don't want to do anything related to like engineering or computer programming. Learning about that is probably important for people that want to live in the modern world. So they're getting this broad base of different types of courses. But the one I was working on, Polaris Ideas, is about helping them think about ideas for their Polaris project that they're going to be working on. And as we mentioned, some of those students already know and come in like ready to go. And other people like need some time to think about it, don't know what they want to do. And it may be more of a sort of academic project for them, or it may be a work of art or a portfolio or something that's not related to business at all. And so this first course that we had was partly reading about where do people come up with ideas, what makes an idea successful, how can we create institutions and cultures that will foster ideas and help build that up. And so it's sort of a combination of different readings. One of the books was about creativity, but it was really about sort of how do you make an idea successful, and it's oriented more towards business, but also related to in the book they talk about different fields like art and science, and I tried to emphasize for the students that this same kind of thought process that you would think of as an entrepreneur is very similar to a thought process that you would have in other fields as well. I mean, obviously, I have a business background. That's what's most relevant for me and what comes to my mind when I'm thinking about these projects in entrepreneurship. But part of thinking about as an entrepreneur, how do I build a successful business, is thinking about like what do my customers want? What do I need to be able to satisfy this demand? And what is going to ultimately make my company successful? And I think that that's true in other fields as well. What is going to make this successful, this project that I want to work on? If you're in science, you need to be able to prove to other people that this theory is correct, or you need to provide some evidence on some existing debate and be able to convince the other people in your field, like this evidence is tells us something about the world that we live in mostly the physical world and science. Um, Whereas if you're in art, you may be wanting to follow on things that other people are doing, do something totally different. And what is your goal in doing that? Is your goal to change the field of art? Is it to influence the way that people are thinking about painting or film or whatever topic? Or is it something that's just personal to you that's about self-expression? Those are very different goals. And so thinking about the question of like, what do I want with this project? What is going to make this successful to me? And that's what you're then going to try to accomplish to make it a successful project. And even in the field of art, you could have totally different ideas. If you're trying to totally change the field, that's something very different than doing something that's just about personal expression. And so thinking about like what is my goal and how do I get there? It's the same kind of thought process for a business that it is for any individual project. And so that's something that I tried to emphasize. We talked a lot about that individual decision and drive, but also, like I said, about like where do ideas come from? How can we, as a community, as a country, create institutions and societies and cultures that are going to foster the development of ideas and innovation?
When you talk about the discussions that you have in your classroom, much of the format of the seminars that students are engaging in is not a teacher in front of the classroom delivering a lecture. It's very conversational and in some ways Socratic. It's a forum for the students to not just engage with ideas that are being presented to them, but like actively grapple with them and bring their own ideas to the table. So my understanding is that a lot of the lecture time or class time is not spent on lecture, it's spent on discussion. What does that actually look like inside of your seminar rooms?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. And so the because this was kind of an unusual course that I taught in the first term, there were some classes where I lectured a little bit, but generally what we did was assign the students to read a chapter or a book or a paper or maybe a set of articles. And then come in and discuss those things. And so some of those topics were pretty clear from the reading exactly what the important point was. And sometimes would be something that was very controversial, and the students would come in and be ready to discuss it. And in those cases where it's really obvious and it's something that it's like, I know they've already got ideas about this and they're going to want to come in and talk and discuss. And in that case, I can basically just sort of guide and help them do back and forth discussion the whole time. Some of the readings were a little bit more difficult, where sometimes it's hard to figure out like the really main point is something that's a little bit deeper. And so in that case, I would just try to make sure, sometimes I would tell them, here are a few important points that you should think about in the reading, come in. And then in the discussion, if the students weren't focusing on that enough, I would really try to draw it out, let them discuss, but then also ask like, what about this? You guys haven't discussed this, or is there another part of that, another side to this discussion that you haven't thought of? Some of the other topics, especially the ones about building institutions that are going to foster ideas and encourage creativity and innovation, because that's really like for me as an economist, that's something important that we want to make the world a better place, and we want people to be innovating and in creating these new things so that we have progress as a society and are able to help people live better, healthier, more fulfilled lives. So how do we help build up these ideas to encourage innovation and progress? Um, and sometimes that's a little bit harder to think about because it takes understanding of events and history of the world that as an 18-year-old you might not have, right? And so in some of those discussions, I would let them discuss a little bit more, but then come in and say, okay, so here are here's some interesting books or stories or evidence that you guys have been discussing like how this might work in theory, but we can look at all these cases from the real world, and that really helps inform our judgments. And so some of those questions are sort of philosophical, and like I was saying about thinking about for you individually, what if you're thinking about a project, like what's going to make it successful to you? That's a very, like, personal thing, but the questions about, like, what have made societies successful in the past, and what are things that help foster innovation, and things that work and things that don't work. Sometimes those are cases where, like, we have to look at history, or we have to look around the world at different countries and their experiences, so that we can understand, what's gonna help us, and what we should try to build, both in terms of, like, culture at UATX, but also for thinking of America and what has our experience been like in the United States and compared to other countries, and how can we make it so that America is successful and continues to be, a leader in the world.
How did you end up at University of Austin? This is a very interesting space to land in the higher education world. It's such a deviation from everything else that is and has been happening. What brought you here?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's I mean, it's a couple of different things. One is that, I like, my background was in business before I got into, academia, and so I personally I'm just kind of an entrepreneur, and always thinking about how to do things different and better. But I'm also not totally satisfied with a lot of, academic institutions and the way that they teach, and it's very hard to change. And so when the idea for the University of Austin was first announced a few years ago, I got a ton of emails from people that were saying, like, "This would be perfect for you." And so it's something
It's
that I've
always a
known.
good sign.
Yeah, yeah, and so I've known about it already for years, but I didn't know, when they first announced it, how it would develop, if they would be able to get certified for the state and have a program and be able to get funding. But they were able to accomplish all those things, and so that was really great. That I was lucky that they wanted to build this institution that was doing things differently. And so basically, the ideas of the founders, were just totally in line with my beliefs already. But it also happened to be the case that, it was just kind of the right time for me. So, my background was that I worked in finance for a while after college. And then I decided that even though I liked that, it sort of just wasn't totally fulfilling to me. And I thought, I would really love to teach. I would really love to be a professor and think about the big picture questions of economics. The thing that I mentioned earlier about how, like, what makes societies progress and innovate and improve to raise the standard of livings and make people's lives better. That is a big important question that you don't think about in finance every day. But I, as a professor, get to think and write about that all the time. And so that was like something that I wanted to do. And so, I quit finance. I went and got a PhD at George Mason University. And I taught for a couple of years, and I was teaching, but also doing some research on, financial regulation and monetary policy, because I had some expertise on that already. And then I wrote some research papers about financial regulations, and through that I got invited to be the, chief economist at the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. And so I spent a few years in D.C. working on policy, working directly at the Senate, helping advise the senators on financial regulation and monetary policy. And since then, that was in 2015, 2016. Since then, I've kind of had this, like, one foot in academia, one foot in the policy world. So I worked for a little while at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which was like a combination of teaching at Rice, but also doing some research. And for the last few years, I've been at the American Institute for Economic Research, doing research, but also doing some media and news interviews, that kind of thing. Um, and I've been thinking about whether I would go back to being a professor, but I just did not want to go to a lot of the universities that are terrible bureaucracies. And I know they're just indoctrination factories and just places that I did not want to be at. And so University of Austin was just a great combination of all the things that I was looking for at a university at a time when I was thinking about moving back into teaching anyway. So I'm still doing some research on the side. I'm still writing research papers. I am still going to DC a couple times a year to talk with policymakers. In fact, I was just there a few days ago or earlier this week for a big conference on monetary policy that was very successful, and we had one of the top people at the Federal Reserve as the keynote speaker for that conference. So that was pretty fun. And I'll go back in January or February to talk with some people in Congress about regulations for the coming year. But really, my emphasis now is just being a great teacher, being in the classroom, encouraging all the students, and making sure that they get exposure to like my experience and all the things that I've been working on, and anything that I can do to help them develop. And so I'm just excited about working with them now.
Why did you get the urge to go back to teaching? I mean, it sounds like everything else you were doing was also very fun.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is interesting, but part of um, being, let's say, I mean, definitely the policy stuff that I'm doing. I want to change the world, right? Like I'm writing research papers and talking with the people in Congress about how to change financial regulations so we don't have another financial crisis, or we don't have a great recession, or all the inflation that we had after COVID. All those things are topics that I'm writing about and talking with the regulators and people in Congress about. Um, but communicating ideas to the public is not always easy. You go on Fox News and you get 3 minutes, or you go on, CNBC or something like that, and they're not going to ask you about like what should we do to have a productive society. They're going to ask you like, should the Federal Reserve raise interest rates? And like that's an important question. I think that's great, but in order to really change people's minds and help them learn about the world that we're living in, help them learn more about economics, you got to spend a lot of time with them and talking to students and young people that are going to go on and be the leaders of the next generation. I think that's really valuable. And so I love talking with students and helping them learn about economics. And I think it's a great guide to how the world works. And so, helping them develop and learn about this and hopefully, go on to lead better, productive lives. Like I just love that. I love teaching.
I don't want to ask you too spicy of a question because I don't want to get you in trouble, but you both attended and taught at George Mason University, which is one of the universities that's fairly well respected in the circles of people who are interested in pushing the bounds of what you can talk about and what you can research. There's a lot of really
Right.
interesting work coming out of there. It's very highly respected. How do you feel like the culture and the academic approach inside of University of Austin compares to George Mason? Like, what are the biggest differences or parallels that you've noticed?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great question. So it's actually very similar, and part of one of the things that shaped my mindset. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I picked George Mason University instead of a more traditional school. Is their emphasis on what's happening in the real world rather than theory, and their willingness to discuss controversial ideas. And that's something that should be happening at every university, but it doesn't. And so, George Mason University, the atmosphere, and this is mostly I'm talking about my experience in the PhD
Mm-mm.
program. The atmosphere was one where you were not just allowed, you were encouraged to have serious debate about all kinds of controversial topics. And this is something that happens at a few universities, but not very many. So, for example, the University of Chicago, that for a long time was the leading economics program in the country, was famous for this, for having just vicious debates where people would challenge each other and push each other, and not quite fist fights, but pretty close to that, But but everyone knew, look, this is not personal. This is not about me as an individual. This is about ideas, and having serious discussions about things that we disagree about is really important. And that's how my experience was at George Mason University as a PhD student. In a lot of my classes, we would read some books or papers that were controversial, and sometimes it was, one paper on one side of the debate and another paper on the other side of the debate. And we would come into class and the teacher would give a short introduction and then say like, go, fight. And then everyone would take a side and we would start these discussions. And even my best friends, like we would have these serious debates. But again, we knew it's not personal, it's about ideas, and challenging each other is how you find out truth. It's how you figure out what ideas that you have are wrong, so that you have a better understanding of what is true and right, and how do you understand the world. And you get a lot of different perspectives in those discussions. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of universities that are like that. And so I have taught some classes in the past where I did encourage the students to have discussions and debates. And the students loved that because they didn't get a lot of exposure to that. And I think that's really sort of the driving force behind the University of Austin. The fearless pursuit of truth. We say, you have to give the students an environment where they are not afraid to have open discussions. And I mean, I have taught at universities where students were afraid to express their true views in the classroom, and we don't want that kind of environment. We want students to have these serious debates, partly because they are part of the university's fearless pursuit of truth, but also because they personally, you need to learn how to engage with ideas and how to, like, let people challenge your ideas without getting upset about it. And I think that's like just a great environment, both for the pursuit of truth and to learn how to become a responsible and tolerant, successful adult.
What are some of the things that you do, and maybe this is an irrelevant question, maybe the students already are very inclined to debate very freely by the time you get to they get to your classroom, and you don't have to do much work to lay the groundwork for them to feel comfortable debating. But how do you set a culture in your classroom where students don't just think you're saying it's okay to say something, but they're still scared deep down that maybe that this doesn't apply across the board. Maybe there's still other things I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
talk about. Like, how do you really encourage them to say exactly what they think, even when it's something that might get them strange looks from everyone else in class?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I mean, there are a couple of different things that we do. One is that we do our classrooms discussions on using Chatham House rules. Like, if people are familiar with that, basically it just means it's kind of like, Vegas, like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and but for academics. And really outside of the classroom, because we teach the same content across different courses, and so we want students in one classroom to be able to discuss with students in another classroom, but not to discuss it with anyone outside of the university. So the don't tweet about it or talk about it, or if you um, have some views, or if you heard something, you can express that idea. You just don't attribute it to an individual. Or if you want to give someone credit, you can ask them, like, "Hey, I think you made a really great point in there. Is it okay? Like, could I quote you on that? Or if I want to tweet about that and I want to give you credit for it, should I do that?" Maybe they'll say like, "No, don't associate me with that." Or they might say like, "Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the compliment." So we tell them, "Hey, you can say whatever you want, and people are not going to know outside of the classroom or outside of the university." We have some professors that express controversial views, and I may or may not do that myself in my classroom. So when the professor is willing to do something like that, I think it makes them a little bit more comfortable as well.
Hmm.
But also, like, I personally challenge them. I said earlier about the readings that we do. Sometimes the students will come in ready to discuss, and already we know that there's people on different sides of this, and they're gonna discuss it and express their views. Other times, I think that sometimes they've just never heard the other side. They hear from the media and from TV and whatever, and they just only know what they've heard. And I have to push them, and I have to say, like, "Look, there's something you guys aren't thinking about here, and this is something that you may not agree with." And so challenging them and pushing them, and then maybe you see, like, okay, actually, some people do agree with that side and other people don't. And then that really pushes them to discuss a little bit more, partly because they haven't thought about it and they need to get those ideas out. And then I think they feel a little bit better about it because I've actually said, like, not only is it okay, but I want you to talk about this thing. This is controversial, and you need to think about both of the sides here and see, you know, if not which side you're on, at least that you understand both sides, right? And so making sure that we're encouraging them to discuss these controversial things, like I think that's part of it. I think the teachers have to do that and kind of push a little bit in cases where the students don't want to speak up or where they're just don't realize how controversial some of these topics actually are. And I think that's what makes it fun. Also, the students love that. I mean, I think it's one of the things that they love most about the university, and a lot of them, it's why they came here, is to have these kind of debates, is to have these kind of discussions that you can't do anywhere else. Um, in fact, we had a student that that I didn't realize. I mean, some of the students, it's pretty clear what their political views are. But there was one student that I didn't realize until the end of the term, that she told me she's politically on the left and was a little bit worried that this university wouldn't be actually open to ideas that, a lot of people in the press are saying, oh no, it's just like a right-wing ideological factory, that they're just using this free speech thing as a cover. And so she was a little bit nervous about that coming in. But she said by the end of the term, the discussions that we had in the classroom had really like opened her eyes and made her feel comfortable to express her own views, and that she had not, feels now like she's not afraid to talk about how she feels about it. And that's something that I too, like, I was a little bit worried about that, and I don't want the students also only expressing one set of views inside or outside the classroom. We want everyone to feel comfortable about talking about the things that are important to them, even if it's something that most of the people disagree with. And so having a place where they can have these controversial discussions is, what we're trying to build. And so far, I think it's been pretty successful.
That was one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, the Chatham House Rule, it makes it alleviates some of the fear of speaking out about either your ideas or things that you're just considering that you might not even believe, but you want to explore and maybe play devil's advocate for.
Yeah.
It takes away the fear of that being misconstrued or misrepresented or overrepresented and getting in the way of your future job prospects or, any public presence that you have or, anything like that. But it doesn't alleviate the fear of the social cost of saying something in front of your peers, which is hard for anyone, but especially a young person who's, going into an adult environment for the first time, and is the relationships that you're making are it's all very intense, it's all very exciting, the social connections mean a lot to you. It can still be really scary even if people can't publicly attribute things to you. That's not really what you're afraid of anyway. You're afraid of the kids that you want to be friends with thinking poorly of you because you've either said something that they don't agree with, or you've just asked what they perceive to be a dumb question or had a dumb take, and the fear of that can be so overwhelming. Is that something that you've also like had to work to build a culture where that fear gets alleviated with time? It sounds like in that anecdote that you just told that has been happening, but I'm curious if you've directly addressed that in any way, because I feel like that's almost more crippling than the fear of being publicly shamed for your ideas.
Yeah, so it is really hard, because the truth is it does all come down to the culture that you build, and that's
Mhm.
just very difficult to do. You can't you can't write it down anywhere. You just have to encourage people and try to guide them in the right direction where they can have open discussions and trust each other, but also be accepting of other people's ideas. Like the Chatham House rules, like, we can write that down, but people could still violate it. And I've been at conferences where people said things in confidence, and then other people quoted them out of context, and so it's like that's no guarantee. But also, like you said, well, part of it is just the social stigma of having people that are disagreeing, and people may not like your views and may hold that against you. I hope that that doesn't happen. I try to make it a little bit easier in the classroom. So, for example, I might say, um, let's explain both sides of this topic. Who wants to do this? Raise your hand, or maybe I'll call on people and like you tell me the for side, and someone else is going to say the against side, and that way someone can, without saying that it's their personal view, explain it and help steelman the argument, and so that we cover all the important points and get the things out that they think are important. But sometimes they do express it as their own views, and I think actually the fact that they're willing to do that is a good sign that the culture is succeeding in the way that we want it to. It is something that it's hard to build. But I think the idea that, like, entrenching the idea that, look, we want to debate and we want people that have different opinions and we want to hear both sides, makes students feel more comfortable outside of the classroom accepting people that have opinions on the other side. Even if it's something that is personal to them, and really important to them. The idea that you can still be friends with somebody that disagrees with you, that's something really important. And so having these debates and discussions where your close friends are saying something different and you are strongly disagreeing with them, helps you understand that, look, we can have different opinions and still be friends. And so, yeah, I think that part of it is like something that you just have to build, and it's difficult. But having these discussions is part of building that. It's like building up that muscle, right? That
Hmm.
becomes just natural to you after having these discussions where you can disagree, and it's not it's not a big deal and doesn't have to be anything personal. Like, people take that to heart and learn that as part of their personality and social structure outside of the classroom as well.
Yeah, it definitely gets easier as you test the waters when you try saying something that you think is controversial and then people are still nice to you afterwards. It gets easier
Right.
with time. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
imagine it's something like this first term is probably the hardest part because you're setting the culture now that will then carry over like every class that comes in from here on out will be drawing from the culture of the classes that came in before. They'll get to meet the students who already are very comfortable clearly disagreeing with each other, and that will embolden you too. I feel like this first term probably was the hardest part, but every interaction that you have makes it a little easier and a little easier and reinforces the the shared commitment to truth, even if you don't all agree on what it is.
Yeah, so I hope that we've done a good job this first year, and that we'll be able to pass that down in the coming terms and then to future classes.
So my understanding is that are there 19 professors for this first year? Is that do
Yeah,
I have that number correct?
roughly 20.
Roughly 20.
Um,
Okay. So 20 positions. My understanding is that it was very, very competitive to get those positions. There were many, many applications and inquiries to be a part of this founding faculty team. I'm very curious what the process was like for interviewing with a university and ultimately being offered a job. Did it feel very competitive?
Yes, I mean I mean, for the same reason that I was interested in UATX. I mean, a lot of other people were too. That they're just dissatisfied with a lot of other universities, and they're bureaucratic and they're ideological, and being, especially in, like, in economics. There are people that haven't learned this lesson that I've been talking about, that you don't take all these arguments personally, and they get extremely upset if you disagree with them. And I don't think that's the way that people should act, but that is how they act. And so that's pretty difficult in other departments. I think it might be, I mean, definitely in some fields, it's basically the case that everyone is on the left. And so there is no discussion, and anyone that's not has to hide that view. And so that's the same kind of problem, to a different degree, right? It's like they're um, just not able to speak out a lot of times, and so yeah, nobody, like, a lot of people in academia are sick of that, and so I think there's a lot of demand for a university that wants to do it different, in the same way that we're getting a lot of great students because we're offering something other universities aren't. The professors also. We have a lot of demand for people that would love to come work at the University of Austin. And so for me, part of the reason that I applied is, as I was saying earlier, is just very aligned with the things that I personally believe and wanted to do. And so, I was lucky that there was an opportunity here in the application process. It was a little bit difficult because, um, well, I mean, I wasn't on the inside when this was happening, right? It's like they had to sort through all these tons and tons of applications. But then also for doing the interviews, the interview process in academia is usually do a couple of preliminary interviews, and then they pick a few people, invite them for a fly out to the university. You come in, you give a presentation, you talk to everyone in the department, you meet the deans, you spend a couple of days like meeting people and doing presentations. You usually give a talk to a classroom to see how good of a teacher you are. Some universities don't care about that, actually. Um, at the University of Austin, there were no students that you could even give a talk to, even though
And there wasn't
teaching.
a department yet.
Right. There were no departments. There were no other economists that could evaluate my research. So they did it a little bit differently in the first year. They brought in 6 professors at a time, all from different fields, and we gave presentations about our research that were non-technical presentations to the deans and the other applicants. So, I gave a talk about economics to 5 people that were all in different fields and didn't know anything about economics. And so I had to explain the ideas that I was working on in a simple way to them and the deans. Luckily for me, I already do a lot of media and policy work that's about explaining the complicated research that I'm working on to regular people and to policymakers so that to help them decide like why this is a good policy or a bad policy. And so that's what I gave a talk about the Federal Reserve and some of the mistakes they made. And when you show a couple of slides, it is really, really obvious when the Fed has made some bad mistakes. And so that made it a little bit easier for me. But it was a fun process because I also got to meet some of the other professors and see the research that they were working on and see how they explained it in a non-technical way that I could understand. And so that was great. And so a couple of the professors that were in my interview group, I thought like that person is amazing. They would be great. I bet they get an offer here. And I was right about that. I'm glad that we were able to bring in a bunch of great professors that way. And I think that we're actually going to continue something like that going forward, even though we have some faculty now. I think it is important for faculty members to be able to explain things in a non-technical way, talk about their research and how it relates to the University of Austin and our goals. We'll probably now have them be able to teach some classes and see what the students think. And so that's an advantage as well. But yeah, part of our process and part of our philosophy at the University of Austin is to be able to communicate to people that aren't just in your field, so you don't have this just narrow understanding of what you're working on, but that it's important and explainable to other people as well.
The founding faculty is it's a very diverse set of areas of expertise and areas of specialization. There's quite a range of different niches that people have filled in their research. And the structure is also very interesting because instead of the kids going into particular majors, there are centers and there are different areas that they can sort of focus their work and their research. But, you're nested inside of the like the class that you just taught is entrepreneurship, not economics. I'm really curious what the structure of that's like from the inside and how you feel like it affects both the types of just the culture of the university and the way that you interact with students, but also the types of conversations and intellectual rabbit holes that this sort of structure you feel like facilitates.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier about how we're trying to give the students a pretty diverse education right from the very start. So from the very start, they're doing this classical education with deep reads of philosophy and literature and um, a lot of like in-depth analysis and discussions, but then they're also doing a lot of quant stuff, right? And so they're getting this diverse experience, and that's going to be true also as they move through with their degrees. We have 3 centers at the university, so rather than picking a major, like students won't major in economics, they will go to one of our 3 centers, which are economics, politics, and history, STEM, and arts and letters. So, and arts and letters includes like art and film and literature and all kinds of things. So, for example, economics, politics, and history, they don't just take economics, they take economics and politics and history and some psych and some other things that are going to be related to social sciences. And they can, if they want, well, we're eventually, if they want to, they can concentrate in economics, which would be like a major, because I think we will eventually have some students that want to go on and do a PhD, and they'll need quantitative courses to be able to do that, and they'll need a lot of training in economics. But most students won't want to do that. They'll want a little bit of a broader base, which I think is healthy. I think for economics, you need to know a little bit about history. You need to know about politics. And so I think it's a great combination of things that the students are going to be learning. And the one of the advantages of that is that they see the same issues for different sides. So, for example, like one really important question in economics is, what is the proper role of government? What should the government do and what should the government not do? And how can we create a government that's going to do the things that it should do and not do the things that are harmful? Create a government that's going to do the most good and the least harm. That is not easy. And so talking in economics about like what is the proper role of government is a very, very important topic. But they'll also get to think about that in politics and government classes. And they'll also take some history classes about, okay, which governments have worked and which ones haven't, and what can we learn from that? And so they'll be able to see these same topics like in different ways. And I think that's really healthy and important for people that are learning economics. I think in economics, there's a lot of people that just don't know as much about history. Otherwise, they would know, like, hey, we have lots of examples of this, and it didn't work out so well the last time, so we need to be careful about doing too much of this. But yeah, I think that's like really appropriate for the students, and if they also, if they want to take classes outside the center, if they want to be in economics, but also taking some quant classes from STEM, they can do that. Or if they want to be in economics, but also take some philosophy classes in the Arts and Letters Center, that's fine. So they have the opportunity to have a much more diverse education than you would get at almost any other university. And again, that's by design. We want them to have that opportunity.
I want to go down the economics rabbit hole with you a little bit
Sure.
because this is one of those things when I post on Twitter and I ask, what are the things that a high schooler should know, not just the standard curriculum, but what are the things a kid should actually know by the time they turn 18? People always jump in, and economics is one of the first things that they bring up. And it's pretty intuitive that this is an important subject, but most people aren't terribly economically literate. It's sort of this, I think to a lot of people, it feels like this sort of intimidating rabbit hole of theory and numbers and formulas, and it just kind of
Mhm.
feels confusing. But it's also really important, and it doesn't have to be confusing because it's also like we live in a world that is built largely on the basis of economics. Um, One of the things that you mentioned before we started recording is that you've actually seen a number of students come in this term who have an impressive grasp of economics already. And I'm really curious what you mean by that. Like when you talk to an 18-year-old who's coming into University of Austin, hasn't taken any college level economics courses whatsoever, what strikes you as being an impressive grasp of some economic concepts?
Yeah, so I personally I think of economics very broadly as being the study of human behavior. So I think of it as sort of like the umbrella of all social sciences, where we're looking at what humans do and how they behave and treating it like science, because a lot of economics is like science. Predictable behaviors that we can understand, and there are other things that like we can't understand, we won't ever know, and learning about the things that we do understand and know and the things that we can't, like that's an important question. And so I personally like just think about it very broadly. And so it's important to learn about how the world works and how people behave. I think that's something that people should all know about. And for me, one of the reasons that I ended up doing my PhD in economics is that I remember in high school when I took economics, and it changed my life even at that time. Like even before I knew I wanted to become a college professor, I just thought man, this explains so much. We did supply and demand, and then we did something like a minimum wage or a price floor or something. And I was like, oh my God, that explains this and this and this, and like all this different stuff. And the professor was able to explain like so much of the weird things that were happening. And it turns out like a lot of it was bad regulations, or it was something like that once you understood was very simple. And that's the important thing about economics, is not like the math or anything. Most of the concepts are actually pretty easy. And the interesting thing is that a lot of those topics are just very counterintuitive, where if you just looked at some problem, you're like, oh, well, this is so obvious. And then you take 10 minutes in economics to explain like, oh my God, it's actually exactly the opposite of what I thought it was. Or a lot of things where people think, oh well, the government can just come in and fix this, and it's like, nope, actually that's going to make this worse. They're like, oh, you're right, we should never do that, why are we doing that, it's crazy. And so I think there are a lot of simple economic topics that people can learn. And when I tell people I teach economics, I get a very split response. That some people are like, "Oh my God, that's the greatest class I ever had," and a lot of people say, "Oh, that's the worst class I ever had." And a lot of times it's they just had a bad teacher. That I think the content is really interesting. And when I teach it, I try to get all the students super interested so that every one of them wants to be an econ major and study more economics. And so the concepts, I hope, are things that people can learn in high school, or before coming to college. That simple things about why very, very basic price controls often cause more harm than good. Questions about what is the proper role of government. Questions about what makes countries rich and other countries poor, and why have some countries that were super rich hundreds of years ago stayed at their same level of income, or basically very poor by modern standards, where other countries that were super poor, 50 or 100 years ago, are now the richest in the world. Like, what drives that? It's economics, and it's the institutions that we create that help foster ideas and development. That's again why I mentioned that the class I taught this term was really important. And so luckily, a lot of the students have learned those ideas and have studied a little bit in high school and came in already kind of prepped and excited about that stuff. And so before I even got involved, the students found it on their own in economics club and came to me and asked if I would be involved with that. And of course, I was very happy about that. Um, and a lot of them have come to me and asked me already if I can recommend readings or something they can do, even though we haven't started teaching economics yet. They're excited to get into that. But another thing is that they've been so interested that I've been trying to get them involved with things outside of the classroom. So I can't remember if I mentioned this to you or not, but I'll just go ahead and talk about it. So this last weekend, I was part of a conference in Washington D.C. where we were talking about the Fed's monetary policy. I mentioned earlier, one of the top officials at the Fed came and spoke at that conference and was the keynote. One of the former presidents of a regional Federal Reserve Bank was one of the speakers as well. And the topic was the Federal Reserve over the next year is going to be doing a review of their monetary policy to see what they can improve. And so we wanted to do this conference like right before that to give our ideas about what is the Fed messed up on, especially the inflation in the post-pandemic period, and what can they do to try to fix it, right? And the students were so interested in that some of them wanted to come to this conference. And so UATX, we ended up funding 6 students to come up to the conference to watch it and to participate because they were so excited about, their econ club and learning about economics. So they got to come up and see me give this presentation about the Fed's monetary policy and the mistakes they made in the COVID recovery that led to all the inflation. And they got to hear all the other speakers. And one of them got up and asked a question, a very good question, to one of the speakers that was great. And to hear, the governor of the Federal Reserve System talking, like I think it was just a really great experience for them. And so to have the students that interested and involved from the very start, and then to be able to promote that interest and get them involved with an event like this, I think is just really special. And there's frankly not very many universities where you would be able to do that. And so I think it's been great for UATX to have the caliber of students that we have, and to give them this kind of experience. And so for people that are, homeschooling or taking economics in high school, like I just encourage that, because I think it's just a great way to learn to understand the world, and something that, especially at UATX, they're going to be able to learn even more about it and profit on. So I think it's great.
Obviously, there will be students who have a concentration in economics and they go very deep down this path of studying econ. But the average student likely won't, although your case is very compelling. You probably will convince a few of them to go deep down the economics rabbit hole. But the average student will get some level of exposure to it. They'll take your classes, they'll learn about it, but they're not going to be, you know, econ majors or the equivalent of. How do you think about the level of economic literacy that you want in a University of Austin student to have to be equipped to go out into the world and understand the economic drivers that are underpinning the world that they're grappling with? Are there, like, how do you think about what that baseline should be, or the ideas that they should have been exposed to, or the level of critical thinking about this that they should be able to engage in? What is, and I'm, perhaps this is something that is in development too, as you're working on the
Mhm.
what the courses are going to look like over the course of their time in the university. But when you think about what you want the average student to graduate with, how do you define that?
Yeah, so we're doing this in two ways. One is that all the students will have to take a course called Intellectual Foundations of Economics, and that is actually it's not an econ class. It's basically a history of economic thought class that is taught more like one of these classical classes. The classical type of education where they've got to do like very deep reading and then come in and have a discussion. We are doing that with ancient economic thinkers, starting with Aristotle and then moving on to a bunch of other early, like before what we would actually call economics, and they're going to read Bastiat and Tocqueville and Hume and Adam Smith, and then eventually later on move on to Hayek and Keynes and some more modern readings as well. And so
I want
every
to take this
student.
class. This sounds amazing.
It is. It's gonna be great. I'm very excited about it. So every student will take this class, and so I hope that they will get exposure both to reading and understanding economic texts and the development of economics, but also hopefully, part of that is that we will um, give them readings that are about some of the most important economic topics as well, right? And so they'll read about, Adam Smith and trade and division of labor and some of his most important insights. We'll talk about Hayek and the price system, and the use of knowledge in society and spontaneous orders and all the like very, very interesting things. And so I think that's going to be great. So that's one thing that I'm really excited about. I'm actually going to be teaching that in the next term. But then for the students that decide to major in economics, politics, and history, we're going to have three core classes that are going to be econ classes. The first two are micro and macro, which are, obviously the most important. And for the third, we did decide to do actually a class about government. And so that'll partly be, how does the government work? What does it do? If it's in terms of fiscal policy, like it's taking money away from some people and giving it to other people, or it's creating regulations, and how does that process work? But as I mentioned earlier, part of that big question is like, what is the proper role of government? What can the government do effectively? And what are the things that it is not good at doing and that we should try to keep it out of? And how do we do that? How do we set up a system where we're going to prevent the government from getting involved in a bunch of areas where it really should not be involved? And that's a good question. And so those courses, I think, really actually line up with some of the ideas that I think are most important. I'd said, thinking about regular supply and demand, that's micro. Learning about price controls and why they cause problems, and what are some basic ways where you could have the government try to get involved, or what are the things that we need to be worried about, right? That's all in micro, and micro is like science. That's understanding the real world. We've got tons of experiments. We know it very, very well. Macro is a little bit less like science, unfortunately. I tell people sometimes it's like the weather, where it's like, are we in a recession or a boom? I kind of know. I can tell you. I can look out the window and tell you if it's summer or winter. But that's like what stage of the cycle might be the most that I could do there. But really, I start off macro when I teach it. Start off talking about economic growth over time, progress for society, raising the standard of living. That is the most important thing. Thinking about people's living standards and our experiences as individuals is the most important thing, and it gets lost a lot of times in a lot of econ classes and a lot of economic discussions. So talking about that first, about the individual and how we help improve things for individuals and how economies grow over time and progress, and that's like the most important thing. Then you later get into, okay, but if we're growing over time, we have these boom and bust cycles. What do we do about that? Is there anything the government can do to get involved with that? Rather than a lot of macro classes, the first thing you learn is like, how can the government control the economy? That's not the way that I think about it. So I think, first thinking about economic growth as the most important thing, and then where can the government be involved or not involved? And so I think those areas of, learning about micro and the fundamentals of economics, and learning about macro and growth, and maybe something about business cycles, and then learning about the government, how it works, what is the appropriate role of government. I think these are super important things. And all the students that are in the Center for Economics, Politics, and History will have to take those courses, but I think some of the other students will as well. And so I'll be excited to be teaching those concepts to as many students as I can at UATX.
Was there an economist or a work of economics that was particularly, I'm trying to find the right, I want to use the term red pilling, but that means too many different things. But I mean it in like the very classic Matrix sense of like all of a sudden you realized what was going on in like the underpinning, like the underlying code of the world, understanding how like, oh, these are all the things that are actually the driving forces behind the world that I'm interacting with, and that
Uh,
made you really excited about economics. Like, was there a thinker in particular that really turned you onto this? And also in tandem to that, do you have a favorite economist or work of economics, or maybe a handful now that have been most influential to you in the long run?
mhm. Yeah, so for me, a lot of that is different topics. So, you have a lot of great economists that have talked about very specific things, and that totally convinced me and blew my mind when I first heard about them. So we mentioned Hayek earlier, and the idea that you can have this sort of spontaneous order through the market, that people are going to get in and try things and figure things out, and the government doesn't always have the information available to be able to manage things at a very micro level. That individuals just trying things is a lot of times the best thing that you can do, rather than a top-down steering kind of approach. I think that's really important. And I think about market signals and the information conveyed in prices, and telling you, like, if a price is high over here, that's an opportunity for profit for an entrepreneur, but it also means for a buyer, you're going to turn and move to something else. And so the signals that come through the price system, I think all that stuff is in Hayek, and it's fantastic. Also, big picture, Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions, and thinking about how, like, some people just have this unconstrained vision that they think, um, any problem, they're like, the government should come in and fix this. And we're like, whoa, 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 wait, we need to think actually in the real world, can the government do a good job fixing that or not? Or the same thing with businesses sometimes, or even science. They'll say something like, oh, well, you know, scientist needs to figure out how to have a car run from dirt. And I'm like, wait, what? That's not how science works. And so people have these weird ideas. And if you understand that we're constrained, you're like, okay, what's the best we can do given the constraints that we have? That's the best that you can hope for in the real world. And that's like hard for some people to deal with, is that, yes, we want to imagine what we can do, but we also want to understand that, we're constrained sometimes. That's really important. In terms of monetary policy, like Milton Friedman, really changed my mind when I read his stuff. I thought, okay, this is really obvious, and I consider myself to be a monetarist in terms of money and macro. I love Tocqueville, and most people don't understand that before the government was so involved with the economy, that most things that the government does today were just done by private individuals. That in early America we had clubs that people just got together and created schools, and they got together and created a fire department or a police force or a library, and like all these different things that the government does today don't need to be done. In fact, for most of US history, were not done by the government at all. Like people just got together and figured it out, right? And so we can still do that, but not if the government's going to get in and do it first. And in the same vein, I mentioned monetary policy. My dissertation advisor at George Mason, Larry White, he wrote some books about the theory of free banking and how monetary policy worked before the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve was founded in 1913. For most of U.S. history, the market supplied all the money. The market managed the supply of gold when we were on the gold standard, and also you had private banks that issued paper notes, and it was just a market, like it's supply and demand, and that's how it worked. And it was like, I would say historically, the evidence says better than what we had under the Federal Reserve. And yet, when I tell people, look, banks could do this, banks could issue their own banknotes, and they say, like, that's impossible. That would never work. I'm like, well, it did work, but if you understand the mechanics of it and why banks were forced to be constrained, and they couldn't take too much risk without a government backstop, and they couldn't overissue the currency because it was bad for them and risky for them. Once you see the mechanics of how all that works and how the supply and demand forced banks to be less risky because of competition, it's it's like you can't unsee it, right? One of these insights, they're just genius, and you can't unsee them. And so I could probably go on and on. Like there's so many things that I think are just great insights in economics, that I absolutely love. But that's why I love teaching it, right? Is like the students come in and I'm like, this is genius. You guys are gonna love this. It's so awesome. Um, so some of them disagree, but a lot of them like really enjoy it too. And so I love that stuff, and I'm excited to be teaching it at UATX.
On the topic of economics and also the future, UATX is also the first ever university to have a Bitcoin endowment fund, which
Right.
is
It's true.
wild. Also, Bitcoin just crossed $100,000. It's kind of a wild time for the crypto world, the Bitcoin world specifically, but also, crypto more broadly. What is there an element of the future of finance beyond just the money as we know it incorporated into the things that you're talking about in class in University of Boston? Like, are you talking about Bitcoin too?
Mhm. Yeah, when I teach macro, I'll probably talk a little bit about it, but I'll eventually teach a class on money and banking that will at least have 1 or 2 days talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. But we're thinking about, I may end up actually teaching a class specifically on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency that would partly be about Bitcoin, the development of it, how it works, why it's important, how people can use it in regimes where they're oppressed, and the government could come and seize all their bank accounts, or women that just aren't allowed to own, bad property and have their own bank accounts, um, and resistance to inflation, like all these different advantages of Bitcoin. But also part of that was that, it was built for the same reason that UATX was built, that people looked at what was being done already and decided, we're just not going to be able to reform this. We're not going to be able to change this monetary system in a way that's going to be good for everyone. We need to design something new. And that's really how Bitcoin came about. And just a quick, a funny historical anecdote. So my dissertation advisor and a couple other economists that I know were part of the like email group, before there was, in the precursor to Bitcoin, where some programmers were trying to figure out, like, how can we have money without government? And there were like several different versions, 5 or 6 different experiments before Bitcoin, when they finally got it all worked out. Bitcoin was the first one that actually worked in a decentralized way, where there was no reliance on a third party, or basically on the network. I mean, you could call the network itself a third party, but no individual that would be a point of failure. And so all that stuff was done by design, where they just thought like, we need a way where we can do this as individuals and not have the government, destroy it or create inflation or interfere with our private transactions. And so they intentionally did that. And so, yeah, UATX too. We're trying to get away from the way things that are traditionally done, the bureaucracy, the ideology, like all the things that are ruining the traditional university system. We're trying to get away from. So I think we do have a similar ethos of trying to do things differently and trying to figure out a way that we can uh, create a sustainable university. And in the same way that Bitcoin has this sort of pre-programmed um, issuance schedule and rules and whatever that are in the programs that all the miners use, UATX, we have a constitution where we are trying to say from the beginning, here are the rules. And that way, hopefully, we don't know for sure, but like we're hoping that this approach will prevent the sort of bloat and bureaucracy and all the things that have ruined a lot of formerly great universities. And so, yeah, I think that we're trying to use the sort of same approach to do things differently, get away from the formerly great institutions that maybe are just too far gone to be reformed, and do something different that we hope will be successful for the long term. So that's definitely our goal.
I have one last question, which is when I'm talking to parents, particularly of high schoolers, and they're interested in exposing their kids to some economics, my first recommendation is always Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, because I think it's a really great just introductory primer to give you a sense of some of the basic concepts of how economics works if you haven't been exposed to it at all. Are there other works that you would recommend as like a preferred introduction, either for a high school level kid, maybe an advanced high school level kid, or for a college student who wasn't at UATX and who was coming to you and saying, hey, I don't have a ton of time to read, but I want to read, one book to really start to give me some sense of understanding. Do you have a go-to recommendation?
Not really. I don't know. I think like, Milton Friedman, like Capitalism and Freedom, and some of his works that were written for the public. Like a lot of those lessons are basically are pretty similar, even though some of that stuff was written in the 1960s and 70s. And basically a lot of those problems are still around. So that might be useful to look at.
I'm curious to know your thoughts on Economics in One Lesson, too, if you think that's a bad recommendation.
No, yeah, I think it's good. I think it's a good one. I think that's something that the a lot of the chapters have good lessons, and I actually I don't remember it that well. I read it years ago, but I have recommended it to a lot of people. I think another set of works for kids that you're familiar with are the Tuttle Twins. So
Hmm.
I gave those to my nieces, and they really enjoyed them.
Yeah, I've
And
had
so
Connor Boyack on the show.
Great, great, right. So yeah, I think that those are good, and I think that there are probably some other. iPencil, is one of them that also I
Yes,
think the Tuttle Twins do
I love
something
iPencil.
about that. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I don't have great recommendations for that. But I mean, to me, like I had said earlier, like just learning the basic supply and demand and how it applied to the real world was really, really valuable to me. And so yeah, anything that you can do to learn more economics, I think, is going to be valuable.
You've been very prolific. You've done a lot of writing in various places. If people enjoy this conversation and they want to learn more about you and your work, where would you send them next?
So I'm still working. My previous research institute, the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER, is still publishing some of my papers. So I write some op-eds and short articles, but also sometimes long academic articles, and so a lot of those are available at AIER. Um, and I'll probably be putting out some more stuff, short articles and some policy papers that I'm working on. So I don't know if that's interesting for regular people. I'm writing some stuff about crypto right now, but also about the Federal Reserve and their, like I said earlier, mistakes in the post-pandemic period. Um, and I don't know. There's some videos of me out there on the internet somewhere. But I'll probably end up at some point writing a Substack, and I think that the UATX Substack also, they put out a bunch of great content from us, and we'll probably mention some of my things. So just keep paying attention to UATX, and hopefully a lot of the good things will come out there.
This has been so much fun. Thank you for indulging all of my questions.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I love talking about economics, so I'm happy to do that. And I think like UATX is doing great, and so I'm happy to brag about all the fun things that we're doing. And I hope some people will be interested in that, and reach out to us or reach out to me if anybody has questions. But yeah, I appreciate you for being interested in these topics as well. And I thought it was fun. I was happy to come on and talk with you.
That I be careful. I might take you up on that again. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Good to see you.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.